Yes.
Yes.
All right. So before I start talking, I thought I'd take a few minutes here at the beginning and ask the group, you know, two questions and you can answer either one. Do you have any experience working with an IRB? And what are your real questions, sort of, if you haven't, about working with the IRB? And you can unmute and speak up, or you can put it in the chat. But I have a prepared session, but I also want to make sure that I'm covering what's on your mind with regard to your questions or worries about submitting a project to the IRB.
I'll jump in. I'll say that this is one of my biggest barriers to getting any of this work done because I get so frustrated with the process.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's still been, it's kind of a mystery to me still, is like understanding like what's an exempt protocol. I'm just surveying the med students. How can this be something that I need approval for? And so doing things that are exempt or expedited, because it seems like most educational projects fall into that category, but I don't understand why, and I don't understand what's different about the processes.
It's a great question, and I would say it's a very common question. And the reality is that it's very different for each IRB sometimes and how they sort of interpret the rules as well. Other comments about prior experience or questions about the IRB that you're hoping to get answered?
Hi.
Hey, this is Lori. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, in my experience, it was really recently during my D32 fellowship, I wanted to conduct some prostate cancer screening to a Hispanic community. And basically, it was the whole issue if I needed the IRB to conduct these screenings, if it's part of the standard of care, if it's what exempt. So it literally took me like almost 2 months to get through the whole process to understand it. And I don't even understand it completely. In the end, for my study, since I'm not conducting any type of research, they were like, no, it's okay, you are exempt. You don't need to go through the whole IRB protocol, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But it was kind of hard to delineate if, ethically, if I'm doing the correct thing, even though they told me it was exempt. But there are like some processes that I'm still kind of, unclear to me.
Sure.
Yeah, so basically it's kind of scary, but at the same time, it's like, okay, they told me it's okay, then I'm okay with it. But it's a little bit complicated for me still in my training phase. But that was my experience basically.
Good. Thanks for sharing. Lori.
Hi. So my question is about using interviews and videos of interviews or videos that you make. And I found out today, which is really good news, but I just want to discuss it a little bit. If you're doing those kinds of activities and they fall under education on the IRB, does that mean your IRB is still exempt? Do you need a consent form from the people you are having in the videos or doing the interviews with if you're going to build them into the educational module? So maybe just a discussion around that.
Are you talking about
Thank you.
videos that are not of like study subjects, but videos of something going on that's part of what you're delivering in your education module?
Well, so in the past, what I've done is, wanted to teach residents about transportation barriers or food insecurity, lived experiences. So I use a lot of lived experiences in my work in
Mm-hmm.
educating residents. And so I do the interviews, I turn those into videos, and I use them in workshops, educational modules.
I see. Interviews
So
with patients.
I don't call them patients, I call them community members. So I
Okay.
go
Yes.
out into the community, I recruit people, I go to homeless shelters, I go to bus stops. So they're not patients, they're community members.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. There's a place in this presentation where I think I can address that, and raise your hand again if I know I answer your question.
Thank
Anyone
you.
else? Great. So it sounds like we're not completely IRB naive, at least for everybody here, but I'm going to sort of talk about this as if you're just learning about the IRB for the first time. So these are the objectives for this session. One is really to describe what the purpose of the IRB is, to list some of the criteria to determine if your project is exempt, expedited, or requires full review, which is, I think, the question that's on your mind. Describe some of the components of an IRB submission, and to talk about the timeline for approval. So IRBs, the acronym is Institutional Review Board. Some institutions call it an ethics committee. Some institutions might call it a committee over, a human subject research committee. But the most common is the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. And they exist so that they can provide an independent evaluation of proposed research to make sure that it's ethically acceptable, that there's potential biases are eliminated or addressed, and more importantly for your institution, to make sure that what you're doing is compliant with all of the federal, state, and local regulations that exist, and there are a lot of them to protect human subjects in research. And you may think, well, I'm just doing this little education project and I'm not really doing sort of hardcore research, so does that really apply to me? And that's where you sort of get into the question of exempted or not. But in education research, learners are considered human subjects. If you are collecting data about or from humans, then by definition, they're potentially human subjects participating in research. And so there's a really broad oversight by our IRBs to oversee the stuff that we do, even educational projects. So this is what most of you probably will do when you think about an educational project that you're going to report in MedEd portal, or you're going to submit into a journal. And it's probably one of the most common sort of formats for education scholarship or education research. And that you're going to have an educational intervention, a module, a workshop, what have you, and you want to know if it's effective. So to know if it's effective, you commonly will do some sort of pre-test or pre-survey to get a baseline level of understanding from your learners. And then you'll do a post-test survey to see if there was a change in attitudes or knowledge or behavior, sort of the things that Rosa just talked about on the Kirkpatrick scale. When you report this out, it's very interesting to the readers, who your learners were. So you most likely are going to collect demographic information. And that's where, depending on the information that you collect, individual privacy comes into account. So, collecting demographic information on individuals that are participating in this, again, is something that the IRBs want to know a lot about. The other thing that IRBs typically want to know a lot about is, how do you get your learners to participate to begin with? Are you recruiting them? Is this required of everybody in the class, and it's just a new module that you want to study? Is this a voluntary thing, an extracurricular thing? Are you giving incentives for them to participate? All of those sort of questions the IRB typically wants to know to help determine, are you really just looking at a routine educational intervention? Or are you truly doing something that's research of something that's new and novel and different? And that sort of question, along with privacy issues around the type of data that you collect, often are the crux of what determines if something's going to be exempt or it's going to be an expedited. Very few, I think, intervention educational projects need full IRB review. So this is sort of the anatomy of your project. And these are sort of the steps you want to think about is, what's your study question and what are you measuring? So, if it's a survey, if it's anonymous, if it's a pre-test and a post-test and you're not collecting their names, again, that's sort of a low risk thing. How are you implementing it? Are you doing your pre and post-test on paper? Are you doing it electronically? Are you de facto learning about individuals, even if you're not explicitly collecting their data? So what you're measuring and how you're doing it and how that data is going to be stored to protect privacy of your learners. Those are the big points that the IRB is interested in. And then after you've sorted all out about you wanted to do for your project, then you should look at your IRB requirements and if needed, touch base with them. And most IRBs, if you go to their website, will have a checklist or a form that you can go through yourself, and it will ask you a series of questions to help you determine yourself if your project is likely to be exempt from institutional review board review, or whether it would meet criteria for expedited review, or whether it would meet criteria for full review. Before I go on, I want to stop for any questions. So, Laura, to answer your question, I would say that, let's see if I go back up, that your videos of your community members, they are part of your educational intervention. So your institution may have a policy related to privacy that if you're going to make videos of people that you're required to have their permission, either written or verbal, but your community members that you're interviewing are not your study subjects per se. Your actual study subjects are your students, your residents, or your learners that may be doing a pre-test or a post-test that's generating the data that's going to contribute to research. If you have to have a permission from to video them, it's really for privacy reasons, and most institutions have a policy around videoing people and using them in your work. But they're not really the human subjects in your intervention. So a big question is, what is your evaluation, i.e. your post-test, your survey, whatever you're going to use. And this is your strategy to determine was your educational experience effective? And if what you're doing is part of routine educational work, you want to change how you do something in the anatomy lab for your students, and you're going to measure something before and measure something afterwards, but all of the students are taking anatomy and they're all doing it. You're just measuring the effectiveness of your new educational pedagogy or strategy. Most IRBs would consider that to be exempt and not research. If you are going to say, well, I think maybe students don't need cadavers and we're going to have these like electronic, fake cadavers or real cadavers. And I'm going to divide the class up and randomize them and say half of the class is going to do the old way of using real cadavers and half of the class is going to use this sort of simulated cadavers. And then I'm going to compare their test scores or their knowledge gaining between the two groups. That the IRB may actually say is true research comparing two different methods, and it may not be exempt. So that's why what's your evaluation and how is it being implemented is often the big crux of what's determined to be exempt or whether it would be expedited. The other big point that IRBs want to know, is this an anonymous evaluation? And if it is, and you're not collecting protected health information and you're not collecting identifiable information about your study subjects, then often that will help your case for this to be exempted from the IRB. You have this problem though, often you want to match up your pre-test and your post-test. So you have to be creative and maybe find some unique identifiers or or use a link or something to ensure that you're matching your pre and your post-test without collecting somebody's name when they're filling it out. So these are the categories for the based on the federal regulations of these of what counts as exempted from IRB review. And one are just routine evaluations of educational practices. And so that's typically where a lot of your work is going to fall and make it qualify to be exempt under category 1. Other sorts of educational tests, interviews, surveys, observation of behaviors. Again, those often, depending on how you're implementing it and the data you're collecting, could also be exempt. Categories 3, 4, and 5 are probably not related to any of the educational things that you folks would be doing during your writing fellowship. However, even if you read the criteria from your IRB and you say, oh, this is an evaluation of a common educational practice, I think my study is exempt, so I don't have to do anything. Well, that's wrong, because the bottom is probably the most important line on this slide. Is the person who makes the determination that it's exempt from review is the IRB itself. So there's going to be a chair of your IRB or an administrator that oversees your IRB. They will look at what you submit and they will determine this meets criteria to be exempted, which means you can just go forward and I don't have to send it to the committee. If you're going to collect some things or do some things, it's a little more researchy. It may not be exempt, but if it's low risk and there's no significant likely privacy breaches, it could categorize for an expedited review, which again means it typically doesn't go by the whole committee, which takes a lot of time, but it'll be reviewed by the administrator and maybe the committee chair to make sure that it meets criteria for expedited review, and you'll get your approval much quicker.
Can we ask
So,
a question in between?
yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a question I think that goes to IRB as well as the quality of what you're doing. If you are not planning on matching your pre and post, so you don't have to have that identifier, a number, how does that change, you think, the IRB approval? And then does that lower the quality of your study if you don't have that match of pre and post? In the past, I've collected pre and post and then used it to assess the entire class. So on the whole, the class learned this. Here are some quotes indicating that the class learned this. The class did not learn this, and these are the areas in which they exhibited no evidence of having learned this concept. So what if you don't have that identifier for your pre and your post, is what I'm asking.
That's a methodological question that you could get pushback from the journal when you go to submit it. And I think it really depends on what you think your participation rate is going to be in your post survey. If you have a group of learners that you're pretty confident that everybody or nearly everybody is going to do both the pre and the post, then by default, you're going to have a match set and you're probably not going to have a lot of bias in your results. But say you have a class of 100 people that all did your pre-tests, and because it's voluntary, only 50 students did the post-test, you have a real non-response bias in your results. And then, so therefore, that's a real limiting factor if someone's going to believe that your results are significant or that your results are generalizable. So if you had a unique identifier linking your pre and your post test, then you could just report out on the data in your study for just the 50 learners who completed both, and you would disregard the 50 that didn't complete the post test. Did that answer your question? I think it's a good idea to try to strive to do some sort of matching of your pre and post tests or your pre and post surveys so that you don't find yourself in that situation. And I've mentored people in projects where this has happened, where their level of completion of the post test was so low that it was really hard to make a meaningful case that learning occurred for the whole group. They could have done it better. They could have made that case better if they had sort of matched tests. And you can make this anonymous. A lot of things like SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics and some of these electronic formats, you can set them up in a way that people get sent surveys and they can match them up, but do something electronic on the background but keep them anonymous. Or only a single person who's a data manager can link it up between the pre and the post. They link them up and then they destroy the key that has the person's name, and then that's anonymous before you as the PI or the rest of your study team looks at anything. The strategy that I've done before is to kind of have your learners make up their own unique identifier on the fly and say, you take the last 2 digits of your birth year, your first letter of your first name, the last number of your social security number, and the first letter of your last name, and put them down. And chances are that's going to be different for everybody. And then you sort of had them create their unique identifier on the fly, and then you could match them up that way. So how are you implementing your materials? This reads as if it's an option, but when you do things through BinGap is often managing the data collection through the conference. But when you think about implementing your materials and you're going to do it at your school or you're going to do it at multiple schools, your school is going to have to approve the IRB, and say you're going to implement it at your own school, and then you've got a colleague at a different medical school or a different residency program at another institution. It may need secondary approval at another institution if you're going to implement your study there, which again complicates the whole IRB situation. So the step 3, touching base with your IRB. Look at the website of your IRB. They should have checklists and worksheets to help you determine if it's meets criteria for exempt or expedited. If you're still unclear about anything, it's totally worth your time to schedule a meeting with a staff person from the IRB. My experience with the IRB, and someone in the beginning said it took a couple of months, is that you tend to have IRB, the administrator who's going to do the intake of your proposal will start reading it, and then they'll get to a problem and they'll go, oh, this isn't clear. And then they'll sort of kick it back to you. And then you answer their question and they go back, and then they go down a little further and they go, oh, here's another problem. And then they kick it back. And all this back and forth can take months sometimes because they don't, for whatever reason, they don't tend to look at the whole thing. So having the thing prepared, sitting down with an IRB person to sort of review it and give you feedback before you actually submit it can go a long way, especially if it's your first IRB submission. It'll help it be successful. A lot of IRBs require you and everybody on your study team that's listed to have participated in a course on human subjects research. Most commonly, it's called CITI, C-I-T-I. So they'll want to know your CITI certification status of all of your team members. And then again, just it's a frustrating process for some people. But the spirit of the IRB is they want you to do your study or your research or your project, but they also take their charge to protect human subjects very seriously. So remaining friendly and that we're all on this, on the same team is a great mindset to help you sort of move forward when you're working with them. And then think about deadlines. Make sure your application is complete. If there's something on the list that you have to submit, submit it. Just don't leave it blank because it's going to get kicked back. You need to submit your proposal to the IRB and have it either declared exempt or approved before you can start implementing your project, and in many instances before you even start advertising, for your educational activity, because a lot of times they actually want to see your advertising materials that you're going to do for your event. If you're not hearing anything back, obviously you could call and check on the status and see if they have everything that they need. This for exempt studies, I would say a minimum of a month. If you're collecting data that may be identifiable data, or you're doing something that's really randomizing people to two groups and studying them differently, that's probably not going to be exempt. I would plan on 2 to 3 months at a minimum for your IRB approval. The other thing is when you look at your IRB application, it's going to ask you questions about the background and why you're doing your study, what your study question is, what method you're using, what kind of data are you going to collect, how are you going to analyze it. And these are very translatable to the write-up and the educational summary report. So you're essentially starting to write your paper by writing the IRB application. So keep that in mind. So that you're really not duplicating work. And this is typically what an IRB application looks like. They require often some sort of cover letter. They'll want a description of your protocol. My IRB, it's an electronic thing. And so you go through the protocol sort of in an electronic form online where you describe the background, you describe your study question, you describe who your proposed subjects are, et cetera. So you're de facto inputting the components of your protocol. You'll have to show them exactly what your pre and post test survey is or your evaluation tool. So this is the type of thing that you're going to have to be prepared to have all ready to submit to the IRB. Hopefully I've answered your questions. Any other questions or thoughts?